Hey everyone, this is Pastor Tori, and welcome to the Bible study that we started. And it's an 11-week Bible study, and it's an overview of the entire Bible. And we do meet in person on Thursdays at 10. This morning was our first time meeting, and that is the lesson that I'm going over right now. And we had a fantastic time. There was a number of questions that came up, and so we're just going to start the Bible study, and hopefully, if you are listening online, that you can contact me if you have any questions. The first week of what we're doing is basically an overview of the entire Bible. We are doing, if you can imagine, being in an airplane and just passing over the entire Bible, it is just a quick overview of kind of everything. And we're not going to go deep into it this week, but it's just going to give you a taste of how the Bible is compiled and how it's organized and just briefly how it's put together. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to share it a little bigger, maybe not that big. Gotta find the right one here. Oh, there's so many options. Look at that. They have new options on here since last time I did this. Okay, we'll use this one. Going right into it, I am going to skip the first few slides because it had to do with more in person than online. And we'll start here. The Bible is not just one book. It is many small books put together to create a library full of stories and history and poems and letters. And the Bible is put together by different authors in different times with different experiences and different perspectives. You can have somebody like Amos, who is one of the prophets, who was a shepherd, coming from his perspective in ancient times, as opposed to David, King David, who wrote as a king over a country, and he wrote some of the Psalms. And those are just two examples. There are so many different authors spanning time, experience, and perspectives. And it is all put together in this book that we call the Bible. Second, how was the Bible created? That's always one of the biggest questions. And it goes back to something called the canon. Over time, some books were chosen to be the official documents of the church, and it is called the canon or canonization. And these books became the Bible. And some of the criteria for choosing these books are, and these are just three of the criteria, is they ask the questions: was the book written by an apostle or somebody that was close to an apostle? Number two, was the theology compatible with other Christian writings of that time? And number three, was it used in the early church community? Was it used in other smaller churches, and was it widespread? Those were three of the questions that they would ask in order to canonize it, whether they would accept it or reject it. And we're going to start very, very simple. The Bible is in two parts. There's an Old Testament and there's a New Testament. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and Hebrew looks something like this. And I'm going to make it bigger. That is Hebrew. And Hebrew is read from right to left instead of left to right. And you'll see those little numbers there. Now, originally, those little numbers weren't there. They were added later, I believe in, the 12th or 13th century. And then the Greek looks like this. And you will notice that there is no spacing between the words. It's all like one big line. That is read left to right. But you will notice that they don't have numbers. And in the early times, they didn't have numbers. They didn't have spacing. That was added later. I believe the Greek was added in the 15th century, I believe. And that is how Hebrew and Greek look. And those are the original languages of the Bible. It's moving on. Why are the books ordered that way? This is one of the questions that I get asked quite a bit in my early days, especially working with youth, because they had to memorize the books of the Bible and they didn't like memorizing that. And so they would just ask, why aren't the Bible books just in alphabetical order? That was their question. And so there is a rhyme and reason to why the books are ordered in the way that they are. Now, if you can imagine, when you go into a library, you will have different categories within the library. You will have a section of books that are fiction. You will have a section of books that are nonfiction, biographies. You'll have mystery, you'll have history, and then you will have sci-fi. And if you think of that when you're thinking about the Bible, it's kind of the same thing. They're called genres. So the Old Testament genres are Pentateuch, which is a fancy word that nobody uses except Bible scholars. It's just the first five books of the Bible. Then you have history, then you have poetry, and then you have prophecy. These are the Old Testament genres. Now, if we look at the Pentateuch, now the Pentateuch is also known as the Law of Moses or the Torah. And within the Pentateuch, there's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are the 5 books of the Pentateuch. And again, nobody uses the word Pentateuch unless you're a Bible scholar. It's more commonly known as the Law of Moses or the Torah. Then you have history. And these books include Joshua and Judges and Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And this tells the story from the time where the Israelites enter into the Promised Land all the way through when they come back from exile in Babylon. So there is a ton of history within these books. And then you have poetry: Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And I need to remind you that just because they're categorized in one genre, like poetry, doesn't mean the entire book is that. For example, with Job, there is poetry in it, but it is story. It is a mixture of genres. And all of the genres seem to have a mixture, but this is what it has been categorized in. So poetry are these 5 books. And then you have prophecy: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, which is a fun name, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And these are known as the prophets. And in some cases, you will hear some people kind of subcategorize them even more and saying the major prophets and the minor prophets. And the major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, the first 5 there. And the only difference there is between the major prophets and the minor prophets is that Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel are longer. The author was just long-winded, as somebody said this morning. They just wrote more. The books are longer. And then we go into the New Testament genres. And they are the Gospels, history, Paul's letters, other letters, and prophecy. And this prophecy is also known as apocalyptic literature. Now, the Gospels contain Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are 4 Gospels that tell the story of Jesus's life from different perspectives. You have Mark, who was probably written first. It is the shortest gospel. It is the fastest paced gospel. It moves very quickly from story to story. It is action packed. You're never going to get bored in Mark. As opposed to Luke and Matthew, they're a little bit longer. They tell kind of the same story, and they actually took Mark as a template and they expanded his stories. And so there is a lot of overlapping between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They will tell the same stories in different ways. And with Luke, he is very detailed orientated. He likes to tell story in these lavish, colorful ways. And then Matthew, he also tells more details than Mark, but Matthew takes it from a perspective of proving that Jesus is the Messiah and going back to the Old Testament and taking a lot of Old Testament verses and applying them and saying this is how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament law or Old Testament coming of the Messiah. That's what Mark does. Not Mark. That's what Matthew does. And then John is very different than the first three. John is a little bit more mystical, has more Gnosticism in it, where he begins by saying, in the beginning there was the Word was with God, the Word was God, he was in the beginning with God. And John tells the story in a way where there's a lot of dialogue back and forth between Jesus and the characters. And John is very different than the first three Gospels. And so that is the four Gospels. And then we have history, and that is the book of Acts. And Acts and the Gospel of Luke were written as one book, but then they were separated into two. So you have Luke and Acts, but they're meant to be read together. And that shares the history of the early church. And it shares Paul's missionary journeys and some of the things that happened along the way. And Acts is a one big long story. And then we have Paul's letters: Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. And Paul's letters are written, some of them are written to specific churches, such as the Corinthians or the Ephesians. It's that church in Ephesus or that church in Corinth. And then you have other letters such as Galatians, where it was written to a number of churches in a particular area, like Galatia. Galatia was a territory. It wasn't a town or a specific church. So Paul wrote to a number of churches in Galatia. And then there are letters that Paul wrote to individuals, such as Timothy and Titus and Philemon. These are all personal letters that he wrote that have become part of our church documents. And then we have other letters such as Hebrews and James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. And these are, I always get sad because I want them to have, Paul has his own category, has his name on it, but then you have the other letters. But these are particular letters are written to churches, they're written to individuals, and by no means are they less than any of the Pauline letters. And Hebrews was actually, at one time, said that the scholars believed that Paul wrote Hebrews. But now, after some time, they don't believe that anymore. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. Hebrews is written in a really particular way where it's very different than Paul's writings. And so nobody knows who wrote Hebrews. Moving on, we have prophecy, the book of Revelation. And Revelation is a really interesting book. Some people have taken it to the point where it's prophecy and it's predicting the future, and they make all these movies such as Left Behind series and things like that. But Revelation is not about telling the future. It is telling about what was happening at that point, in that day, in that time with the early church. Now, during that time, Nero was persecuting many of the Christians and arresting them and killing them. And the horrific ways in which they were murdered was anything between putting them in a coliseum with wild animals and having them being ripped apart to having them be put out as torches, and they were lit on fire to light the pathway that people walk down. And it was a horrific time within the church. And so when somebody was writing a letter to encourage a church, or one of the apostles or one of the teachers would write a letter to a church to encourage them, to say, hey, hang on, um, Jesus is coming back. It's, I know we're getting persecuted right now. This is bad, but in the end, God wins. And Revelation was written in a way where it was allegorical. And so you had this story of all this imagery of these dragons and serpents and different types of animals and the horsemen. And you have this visual imagery of Revelation and the end times. And really, it isn't about, as I said, predicting the future. It was about this author trying to encourage the church in that time and in that day that was getting persecuted to hang on. And so they couldn't necessarily write it and say, this is what's going on. And he couldn't just directly say it. He had to hide it in some type of way. He had to write it in a way where the church understood, but if it was caught or if it was confiscated, that it would be kind of tricky to interpret. And so Revelation is known as apocalyptic literature. It's kind of like the ancient sci-fi, if you can imagine that. Like with Star Trek, those who listen and watch Star Trek, you see it as, like with Star Trek, they tackle social justice issues in the way of telling the story in a way where you're in space, but yet it's a social justice issue. Think of Revelation in that way. It was a way of communicating to people about the injustice of the world through allegory. And that is what Revelation is. It's basically ancient sci-fi. And moving on, during the Reformation, there were Catholics and there were Protestants. And when the Protestants became Protestants and left the Catholic Church, they took a look at Scripture and they looked at the Bible and said there are some books in the Old Testament that don't belong there. And they took out a number of books from the Catholic version of the Bible. And this is a list of them. Tobit, Judith, Baruch, Maccabees. And to be honest, I'm not familiar enough to speak on any of these. I just know that these were the ones that were taken out of the Catholic form of the Bible after the Reformation. Okay, this was for the class this morning. And there's some major events in the Old Testament. 3 things to keep in mind, or 3 events to keep in mind, is that Israel, or Hebrews, they're also known as Jews. So Israel, Hebrews, Jews, they're all the same people group. In Exodus, they share their story about their slavery in Egypt, their oppression, and their escape from that. That is told in Exodus. There is another traumatic event that happened, and that which is covered in Chronicles and Kings and Ezra, Nehemiah, those historical books. They cover the Assyrian taking over the northern kingdom and the Babylonians taking over the southern kingdom. And then they were taken into captivity for, I forget how many years, either 50 or 70 years. They were taken into captivity for that long. And so much of Israel's story, they tell their story from an oppressed perspective. And that's important to remember when you're reading the Old Testament. They have this oppression going on of them trying to create and ask questions who they are. Are we God's people? How are we God's people? How do we do this? And that is the Old Testament in a nutshell, is basically the Israelites trying to figure out who they are and why things happen to them. And then there is the intertestamental period, which is a big fancy word for that one page that's between the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's always like this little break in between when you were looking at your Bible, and then all of a sudden Old Testament stops, maybe one page in there, and then there's the New Testament. And that one page represents 300 years of when the Bible was silent. And people often ask the question, well, what happened during that time? Well, the Greek Empire happened during that time. Alexander the Great came in and basically took over the land. They Hellenized the entire area. People had a different way of paying taxes, a different language, a different way of life. They had to adapt. And then when that Greek Empire at one point in time became weaker, that's when the Maccabean revolt happened, and you can read about that in the Catholic books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees. And then later on, you have the Roman Empire coming in and taking over the Greek Empire in that same territory that Israel is living in. And so now Israel is living under a Roman Empire with a different language, taxes, different way to pay for food. I mean, life is totally, totally different for them. And this is where the New Testament comes in. This is where Jesus is born. And this is where, well, this is the life and the kind of world that Jesus is born in. And so we have major events in the New Testament. We are more familiar with these. Major events of the New Testament consist of the birth, the ministry, the death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We also have the early church's story, which is in Acts. We have Paul's missionary trips, which is in Acts. And then we have a number of letters and advice to early churches and individuals. And that is kind of the overview, the really general overview of the entire Bible, going from Genesis to Revelation. And this is where we start. Now, as we go on, we will fly a little bit lower. And next week, we're actually going to look at just the Pentateuch, just the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And we're going to do a lot of storytelling during that time. And we're just going to kind of figure out what is in each of those books and how that lines up and why. Why did they write their story down in that way? So that is about it. I hope you guys are having a good week. Our in-person Bible study is Thursday at 10 at church. And after that, I will do another recording. And yeah, give me a call if you have any questions, or email me if you have any questions. Hope you're having a really good day, and we'll talk to you later.